Well, good morning. About time to begin our Bible class this morning. Good to be back today after me and Christy been out a couple of weeks. Appreciate Brother Ed filling in. We'll actually be out again next week too, so Brother Ed will be finishing up next week, and then hopefully after that we'll get back to normal, and I'll be here. I don't know. I might just let, if Ed wants to, I might just let him just keep on, just take over my Bible class. No, I appreciate Brother Ed filling in, and next week we'll be out again, and then hopefully things will get back to normal after that. We've had a lot of busy holiday stuff, so before we begin with our Bible class this morning, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and all the many blessings of it, Father. Thank you for all the many blessed life you've given us, and know you bless us so richly, Father, and I'm grateful for this Lord's Day and opportunity we have to assemble together this morning, Father. And as we go into the Bible class hour this morning, I pray that we can study your word with open minds and open hearts, Father. I pray we'll always be good stewards of your word. I pray that we can learn more about your word and what our duties are to you, Father. And I pray you'll bless us as we go in this Bible study, and bless us as we go into the worship hour here shortly, Father. And pray that we'll do worship you in spirit and in truth, and everything we do here today, Father, will be done in ways pleasing to you. And pray for your continued blessings upon all those that are sick or hurting, and those that are grieving at this time, Father. Pray for your blessings upon those that may be traveling over the holidays, and pray for be your will that they can have safe travels and everybody can make it back home safely. And pray for your forgiveness for any sins that miss in our life, Father. Help us always live according to your will, and pray for your continued blessings upon us and everything we do. In Jesus' name, amen. So a couple of weeks ago, we left off in Matthew chapter 23. So we finished verse number 4. So far we've been through Matthew 23, verses 1 through 4. So just a quick review, I guess, kind of where we are before we pick back up in verse number 5. So after Jesus has had his authority questioned in the temple, so he's been to the temple. The chief priests and elders and scribes had challenged his authority, and then he gave some teachings there and some parables to them. Then the leaders there, the chief priests and elders and scribes, had sent some spies to Jesus. They're asking some questions so that they could entrap him in his talk. Hopefully, their goal there was to at least be able to catch him in some kind of contradiction of his teaching, so that they could make him lose some favor with the people that were following him, the multitudes. And at best, they wanted to be able to find something worthy of death that they could execute him. So they sent these spies. They asked him 3 questions. And Jesus responded in a way to those 3 questions that completely surprised and amazed the people. And then Jesus responds with a question of his own, which the Pharisees and Sadducees and those there standing were again amazed, and they couldn't ask him, or they couldn't answer his question. And then from then on, we're told that nobody asked him a question anymore. So, Jesus was able to silence those that were questioning him. So chapter 23 picks up, directly following that exchange. So Jesus is still in the temple. His disciples and the multitudes and all those are still standing with him. Most likely, probably some of the Pharisees and Sadducees that were questioning him are probably here. We don't know for sure because we're not really told who all is part of the multitude. But I would think it's probably reasonable to assume that maybe some of the chief priests and elders were at least in earshot of Jesus. Maybe some of those Pharisees and Sadducees that had questioned him were probably at least there, still in earshot of Jesus. But regardless, there's a multitude of people here, including his disciples, that Jesus is talking to now. So, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at, Matthew 23 verse 1 says, Jesus spake to the multitude and to his disciples. If you look at some of the other gospel accounts, it appears that Jesus is at least speaking to both of them. So he's teaching, he's giving some teachings to both of them, but it seems to be somewhat directed toward his disciples, but in the presence of the multitude. So there's the lesson to his disciples, but there's also a broader lesson, a broader application to the multitudes there as well. So, and then Jesus, verses 1 through 4, kind of gives some warnings or some guidance. How the disciples, how the people should be, interacting, or how they should be, what they should be doing regarding following the Pharisees. He tells them, basically do as they say, but don't do as they do. So the Pharisees and scribes and, the leaders would have been the ones that had the law of Moses. They would have been the ones that, read the law or interpreted the law to the people and different things. So we talked about how Jesus is telling them basically, the things that you hear of the law, the things that you're taught of the law of Moses, do those things. Observe the law and follow those things, but don't follow after the works of the Pharisees, because their works are all hypocritical. And he says in verse number 5, we'll get to in a little bit, that everything they do is to be seen of men. And everything that they do is hypocritical as far in regards to their works. And Jesus tells them that, basically, they give the people these burdens. They lay these heavy burdens upon the people to follow in regards to the law, but then they don't follow these burdens themselves. And my understanding is that some of these heavy burdens that the Pharisees put on the people, were things that were in addition to the law of Moses. But the thought there was that these extra things will help you better, observe or better follow the law of Moses. Was supposedly the original intent of these heavy burdens that were put on the people. But what Jesus is saying is, not necessarily rebuking, these works or these things that would help you better follow the law of Moses, but he's rebuking the hypocritical actions, hypocritical works of the Pharisees, where they put these burdens on the people. But then, in verse number 4, he says, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. So, they're hypocrites in action, and they say and they do not. So Jesus is warning his disciples and the multitudes, to not go after the works of the Pharisees. Instead, follow the law of Moses as you're instructed by the law of Moses. But other than that, don't follow after the Pharisees, because their works are hypocritical. They're hypocrites in the things that they do and things that they say. So we'll get into verse number 5 this morning. We'll see that Jesus kind of gives us a glimpse into maybe the heart of the Pharisees, what their motivation, what's the motivation for their hypocritical actions and being hypocrites. And he tells us in verse number 5 that it's so they can be seen of men. So it's a prideful and a self-pleasing attitude that the Pharisees have that leads them to be hypocrites, and do these hypocritical works. So starting in Matthew chapter 23, let's read verse number 5. Jesus is speaking. He says, but all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries, and enlarge the borders of their garments. So first off, the first thing we can notice is that they want to be seen of men. That's the first thing Jesus tells us, is that the Pharisees want to be seen of men. And he makes two other statements that are much less obvious to us. So when Jesus says that the Pharisees want to be seen of men, we understand what that means. They have a prideful, self-serving attitude that they want to get the glory of men, or they want to do things so that the people around them can praise and honor them for their good works and things that they're doing. So we understand that. When he says they make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments, that's not something that's just straightforward and clear to us, because this had a lot to do with some Jewish cultures and customs and things. So we'll look at this morning, kind of look into what do these two things mean, and then I think it helps us really understand the thought there that the Pharisees want to be seen of men. So the word phylacteries could also be called frontlets. And Smith's Bible Dictionary has this to say about the phylacteries. It says they were strips of parchment on which 4 passages of Scripture were written in an ink prepared for the purpose. They were then rolled up in a case of black calfskin, which was attached to a stiffer piece of leather, having a thong 1 finger broad and 1.5 cubits long. They were placed at the bend of the left arm. Those worn on the forehead were written on 4 strips of parchment and put into 4 little cells within a square case on which there's a Hebrew letter. This Hebrew letter was written. The square had 2 thongs on which Hebrew letters were inscribed. That phylacteries were used as amulets is certain and was very natural. The expression, they make broad their phylacteries, in Matthew 23 and verse 5 refers not so much to the phylactery itself, which seems to have been of a prescribed breadth, as to the case in which the parchment was kept, which the Pharisees, among their pretentious customs, made as conspicuous as possible. It is said that the Pharisees wore them always, whereas the common people used them only at prayers. So the phylacteries were pieces of paper or pieces of parchment that had scriptures written on them that they either had, in some kind of case that was bound to their left hand, or they would be bound, some way to their forehead. And there was 4 passages that were written on them. We'll look at these 4 passages here in a minute. But this was a Jewish custom that they did in order to help remind them of these passages. But the point of it is that that we'll see is that the Pharisees made broad their phylacteries again so that they could be seen of men. But if you go back to Exodus chapter 13, there was 4 passages that were written on the phylacteries. One of them is Exodus chapter 13. And that would be the first 10 verses in Exodus chapter 13. Starting in verse number 1 of Exodus chapter 13, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Sanctify unto me all the firstborn, whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. And Moses said unto the people, Remember this day in which ye came out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out from this place. There shall no leavened bread be eaten. This day came you out in the month of Abib. And it shall be, when the Lord shall bring thee into the land of Canaan, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he sware unto thy fathers to give thee, a land flowing with milk and honey, that thou shalt keep this service in this month. 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and in the 7th day shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and there shall no leavened bread be seen with thee, neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, This is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. And it shall be for a sign unto thee upon thy hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes, that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hath the Lord brought thee out of Egypt. Thou shalt therefore keep this ordinance in his season from year to year." The next one's in the same chapter, picks up in verse number 11. And it shall be when the Lord shall bring thee into the land of the Canaanites, as he sware unto thee, and to thy fathers, and shall give it to thee, that thou shalt set apart unto the Lord all that openeth the matrix, and every firstling that cometh of a beast which thou hast, the male shall be the Lord's. And every firstling of an ass thou shalt redeem with a lamb, and if thou wilt not redeem it, then thou shalt break his neck, and all the firstborn of man among thy children shalt thou redeem. And it shall be, when thy son asketh thee in time to come, saying, What is this? That thou shalt say unto him, By strength of hand the Lord brought us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh would hardly let us go, that the Lord slew all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all that openeth the matrix, being males, but all the firstborn of my children I redeem. And it shall be for a token unto thine hand, and for frontlets between thine eyes, for by strength of hand the Lord brought us forth out of Egypt. The next 2 are in Deuteronomy. The first one's in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. Starting in verse number 4, Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thine soul, with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. And then the last one is in Deuteronomy chapter 11, starting in verse number 13. And it shall come to pass, if ye shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, that I will give you the rain of the land in his due season, the first rain and the later rain, that thou mayest gather in thy corn and thy wine and thine oil, and I will send grass in thy field for thy cattle, that thou mayest eat and be full. Take heed to yourselves, that your heart be not deceived, and that you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. And then the Lord's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven, and there be no rain, and that the land yield not her fruit, unless ye perish quickly from off the good land which the Lord giveth you. Therefore shall you lay up these my words in your heart and in your soul, and bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall teach them your children, speaking of them, when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when you liest down, and when you risest up. And thou shalt write them upon the doorposts of thine house, and upon thy gates, that your days may be multiplied in the days of your children, in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give them, as the days of heaven upon the earth. So these are four passages that all have to do with God's promises unto Israel, right? We see there's the promise of coming out of the land of Egypt, the promise of the land of Canaan, and then the promise that he has to sustain them in the land of Canaan, as long as they're faithful to him. So we see, you notice there's several times the phrase frontlets, or the word frontlets is mentioned. This is to be on your hand, or frontlets between your eyes. So there's some scholars that think that the physical practice of having these on their forehead and on their hand was not necessarily implied by the Scriptures, but it doesn't necessarily look like Jesus was condemning the practice of having these as much as he was the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. So it was the phylactery was a literal or physical embodiment of God's command for his people to remember his blessings. So he'd give them these blessings in the land of Canaan, and part of it was so that they could remain faithful unto God. So when Jesus says that the Pharisees make broad their phylacteries, he's meaning that theirs were most likely unnecessarily larger than everyone else's. This was so that everybody could see that the scribes and the Pharisees were more righteous, or at least that was seems to be the intent, that they made, whether their phylactery was bound to their hand or bound to their forehead, there seemed to be a common a size that these were made to, but apparently the Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees, made theirs much larger than everybody else, so that you could, it was unmistakable. You could see them, so that everybody saw that they had theirs on, and they appeared more righteous than everyone else. In Smith's Bible Dictionary, he also notes that the common people wore them only during prayers, but the Pharisees wore them all the time. So now you got another distinction that the Pharisees put between themselves and the common people, is that they wear them all the time, where everybody else only wears them during specific times of prayers. So theirs were abnormally large. They wore them for a period of time that was unlike everybody else. This was all, when Jesus tells us in Matthew 23 and verse 5 that they want to be seen of men, this was all so that they could be seen of men. It doesn't appear that Jesus is condemning this practice, but what you see is that the Pharisees are observing this practice, but they're observing this practice for the wrong reason. They're not trying to remember God's promises and God's blessings unto them and remember God's law. Instead, they're turning this practice, this observance, into a way for them to receive the praise of men. They're doing it all for the wrong reason. So again, they're seeking the praise of men, and they're being hypocritical in their actions. So next, Jesus says, verse number 5, that they enlarge the borders of their garments. So again, this is something that's not it's abundantly clear to us right off the bat. What does it mean? What does that imply? So if you go back to Numbers chapter 15, we'll see a similar command or a similar observance given by God in Numbers chapter 15, starting in verse number 37. So in the New Testament, the word for border, when it says the border of their garments, Thayer defines this as a little appendage hanging down from the edge of the mantle or the cloak made of twisted wool. The Jews had such appendages attached to their mantles to remind them of the law. This practice was in accordance with the direction given to God in Numbers chapter 15. If you look at verse number 37, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye used to be a whoring, that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. So the idea of the fringes on the garments, some people might call them tassels. Maybe it's similar to a tassel where it's a piece of wool that's wound together. But the idea of the fringes on the garments was that the people, number one, it has a ribbon of blue wound into it. H. Leo Bowles, in his commentary on Matthew, says that the blue was there to separate the Jews from the heathen, so that there was an easy identification that you're not a heathen because you've got this blue, on the fringe of your garment. But we see from Numbers 15 here that at least the purpose was for when the Jews saw these fringes on their garments, or maybe they saw the fringe on somebody else's garment, that was a reminder to them of God's law. That we should be following. They should be following God's law. And it even says in verse number 39, for them to not seek after your own heart and your own eyes, which you used to go a whoring. So it's a reminder that I'm not following my own desires, and I'm not going after the things that I want to do. When you see these fringes on the garments, it's a reminder of God's law. And that's kind of a good idea. You think when you see it, especially maybe if you're in the midst of maybe you got a thought or an idea that I'm going to do something, and you see this fringe, maybe I need to do this. You got a comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking of kind of how, from the Pharisees' point of view, or what Jesus is telling them, or their motive behind it. The first thing that comes to my mind is, well, what can we see today that's very similar? That it's an outward thing that really, doesn't show really what's in your heart. Doesn't show your true motive, something outside. And the first thing that comes to my mind was people may wear a cross. There's nothing wrong with wearing a cross, but that's maybe try to show other people that I'm trying to do what's right.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that that's what you're doing. I mean, anybody can wear a cross.
Right.
And then another thing is these health and wealth gospel, so-called people that are preaching this health and wealth gospel, and faith healers and all of those individuals. Their motive behind it is, well, what can I gain about it? I got this fame and this reputation and all of those things that go with that. And they're right there. They're saying one thing, but their motive is somewhere else. And this is going all the way back to the law of Moses and the inception of all that. And these things that they were doing, there's good implications for that for the people.
Right.
To
Yeah.
keep in their mind.
Right. Yeah.
It's like wearing a cross. Every time you look down and you see a cross, you think about, well, what blessing do I have today? And it should ever be present in our mind. But just because they wore those things, Jesus is saying, look, your heart's not right. You're doing this for the wrong reason.
Exactly.
And I think maybe we need to be careful. Not that we're a Pharisee by any stretch, but I think we need to be careful that maybe we don't get too comfortable and lose sight of where we should be focused and just get too comfortable. Well, I'm in the pew today.
Right.
I'm showing everyone my car's in the parking lot. I'm showing everyone where I'm at. But where is your heart? Where it needs to be? We always sometimes that needs to be thinking of that. I just thought something on my mind.
Yeah, I agree with that. And looking at this, you can see that the passages that they were remembering were very, very specific passages. It wasn't things of just, where, just one passage here and there, just or I reading a passage a day, or not that there's anything wrong with that, but these were reminders, memorials for them of very specific things. This is what God did. He brought you out of Egypt. You got to follow His law. He's going to bless you when you're in Canaan, as long as you follow His law. If you don't, then He's going to take the reins from you and all this other stuff. And I look at that and I think, well, that it's very specific, and it helps. Maybe I can see where it could help keep you focused on every time you see this phylactery or amulet or frontlet or whatever. That every time you use it, you think about those specific passages, and then the fringes on the garment, same thing. Like where it's you see that as I'm supposed to be walking after God's law, not my own law. I think the intent there is, I think it's a good idea. And I think today what would be a good idea? I'm thinking, well, what if I had something on, I put on the mantle by my TV that said, abstain from all appearance of evil or something like that. And every time if you're watching a show, you're watching something. Well, maybe I shouldn't. And I'm looking at, well, maybe I shouldn't be watching this. Maybe there's stuff like that you see that what could you do in your life, to have those same reminders, it's going to help you walk better. So I can see the intent there. I think it's a good idea. If you could incorporate something like that into your life, it helps you walk better. But the whole idea here being that the Pharisees observed these things, but they sort of twisted them into their own thing. Right, yeah, that's right. That's true, yeah. That'd be the same thing, right? That's right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah, for sure. Mike?
Is that one reason why assembly with the saints is so important? Just to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week.
Yeah.
Brings back to our mind of why we do what we do.
Yeah.
Christ and Him crucified. And even though we don't have that physical thing that brings back the phylactery or the border, but yet the Old Testament was a shadow, so what's the real thing? And I think, Christ and Him crucified, and we keep that in the forefront of our minds, then it helps us to be that person that God wants us to be.
Yeah, that's a good point too, Mike. Yeah, maybe that's the memorial we have in the New Testament. So, maybe.
We can get everything pertaining to life and godliness, and God didn't give us anything to wear.
Right. Yeah.
So it's got to come from somewhere else, and that's got to be a word of His in my heart, and simply with the saints, and the things that He's provided for us to do is supposed to be what keeps us on the straight and narrow if we practice it. We can be hypocrites.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think maybe the important part of that is like Roger say, maybe you can get calloused in how you take the Lord's Supper because it's something we do every week, but are we really focusing on the meaning of it and and all the implications of stuff like that? So that's true.
every day of the week, sometimes during the day, or maybe several times during the day, we ought to think about the sacrifice Christ made for us, blessings the Lord has given us, offering us this kind of salvation, how we can live. I mean, after our mind, it's pretty hard to control the thoughts and focus in the right way.
Right.
But the sacrifice of Christ made, we ought to think about that pretty often.
Yeah, I agree. Not just when you take another Lord's Supper, right? So that's, we do have a memorial that we do every week, but as Christians, we should be thinking of that and the other blessings more than just once a week, right?
You know, Adam, obedience has always been a matter of heart. No matter what you do or what God commanded you to do, some folks, intentionally or unintentionally, they will stray from the truth. And it's up to us as a group to keep each other on the straight and narrow.
Right.
And up to us individually keep ourselves on the straight and narrow. It's going to be a battle all the way till we die. That's just what it is.
Yep. And I agree with that, Mike.
Adam, all this goes back to the law, like to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, like quoted it
Mm-hmm.
in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. And the motive behind it has already been brought out. Whether you're genuine, whether you're sincere, you do it to bring glory to God. Jesus talked about Matthew 5 when he saw the world, the light of the world. And we do what we do. We're talking about the Pharisees. Don't do as I do, do as I say.
Yeah.
Well, we do our works not to glorify ourselves, but to glorify God. That's what the Pharisees were not doing.
Yep.
Paul, I just thought passage in Philippians chapter 2. We talked about preaching Christ. We talked about some preaching Christ of envy and strife, and we said some preach Christ of contention and not sincerity. There we were those in Paul's day, preachers, who were actually doing the same thing that these people were doing. They were not sincere in this thing.
Right.
That's just exactly what Mike was talking about right there. It's where the heart is. That's where everything comes from.
Right.
It's not coming from these fires.
Right. Exactly. Not from their heart.
Right. And that's, Paul addresses that here. In the Philippian letter, he was in the church, in the first church.
That's a good point, yeah.
But what he's referring to, Paul goes on to say, maybe they're doing it for the wrong purpose, but they're preaching the truth. I mean, the truth is still the truth. If you preach it for the wrong purpose, that'll be up to you and God. But if you preach the truth and people obey it, it's still being ministry.
At least people still hearing the gospel.
And the that's the Pharisees who do what they say, but don't do what they do. So you can have a preacher or a teacher or whatever. You might be teaching you the truth. You look at your lifestyle, what's his motive for doing it, whatever. That's not making the truth of what I said. That's just up to him and God.
That's true. You can say he could be a modern day Pharisee. He's not practicing what he preaches.
Like Paul was saying here, he's preaching the truth, and some is preaching with the wrong intent. They're still preaching the truth.
Right. Yeah.
Other than the example they were presenting, the wrong example, that they're preaching the word of God, and still are fruit and sowing the seed.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what Jesus is saying about them, about the scribes and Pharisees, that they're still the executors and the readers of the law of Moses. So as they tell you the law, observe the law, but don't follow after their hypocritical works. Yeah, their motive there. Yeah, the law is still effective and it's still in action and all that, and but yeah, obviously their motive is what's missing. Yes. To me, I think the irony of this whole thing we're talking about here with the Pharisees and in Matthew chapter 23, we go back here and look in the Old Testament of here in Numbers chapter 15 with the the fringes on the garments, what the purpose of that was. You look at the phylacteries, the verses that were given, the purpose of that, these reminders to them. Again, in Numbers chapter 15, verse number 39, it says, "And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to be a whore." And so it said, this is things you used to do, but the whole reminder is that this fringe is supposed to be reminding you to do God's law, reminding you of God's law, and reminding you to not seek after your own heart, no, seek after your own eyes. And to me, the irony in this whole thing is almost comical when you think about it, because the Pharisees have taken something that God has said, if you do this, then the whole point of this is to remind you to not follow your own eyes, your own desires, but to follow my law. And now the Pharisees have taken that and turned it into something they're using to seek after their own heart. And Jesus says that they seek the praise of men. They do it to be seen of men. So the very emblem here that God is saying is God has given them, to remind them to not seek after their own heart. They're using that to seek after their own heart. Because when Jesus says they enlarge the borders of their garments, again, I guess if you put, there were some blue fringes in there. There were, so at the very least they were. It was following here in Numbers 15. Some other commentaries that I read said it was to separate them from the heathen, right? But if you take all that into account, the whole purpose was that the Pharisees have, fringes on their garments that are larger than your garments, or maybe there's a more blue than the blue on your garment, but the whole purpose was that they can be seen much better than the normal fringe on the garment. So you see them walking, it's unmistakable, that their fringes are bigger than everybody else's, or maybe they're more blue or whatever, but they can be seen much better than anybody else's fringes on their garments, so that they appear more righteous, unto men. They couldn't care less, really, what we're seeing about actually following God's law, being reminded that they should be seeking God's law and not their own heart. So I think it's the irony there is just, is tremendous that they've taken this emblem that God is saying this should be an emblem to remind you to seek after me and not after your own heart. They've turned this into something they use to seek after their own heart. It's the irony there is crazy to me. There's so much. If you look at continuing on in verse number 6 and 7, Jesus says they love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues. Verse number 7, and greetings in the markets, and be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So again, we see this. They want to be seen of men. They want this praise of men. That's the purpose of them doing all this. I don't think we can, or at least to me, the first one of the first things that comes to my mind as you're reading, especially verse 5 here in Matthew chapter 23, is all the way back in Matthew chapter 6. We got a few minutes. I won't spend the rest of the time this morning looking at Matthew chapter 6, because we get, really, I think that chapter 23 and verse 5, when Jesus says they want to be seen of men, is really, I think, can be taken as almost as a summary of Matthew chapter 6 that Jesus taught here in this sermon against all these things that people are doing to be seen of men. So to me, Matthew 23 verse 5 really calls back to Matthew chapter 6. I don't think that he specifically mentions the scribes and the Pharisees in this context. I could be wrong, but I don't think he mentions them specifically. But I think the idea, he mentions hypocrites for sure. I think the idea, the hypocritical actions and things that they're doing fits this perfectly, right? So going all the way back to Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse number 1, verses 1 through 4, Jesus is talking about giving alms. And then we'll look at, we got almsgiving. Starting in verse number 5, we got prayer. And then in verse number 16, we've got fasting. So we got three actions, three works that Jesus is talking about. And I think one thing that's important we can pick out is that as we go through each one of these, there's a motivation for doing the things doing it the way that they're doing them. That we'll see. I just want to notice that as we go through. Starting verse number 1 of chapter 6. Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which is in secret himself shall reward thee openly. So notice in verse 2, Jesus says that they sound the trumpet. They want to stand in the synagogue. They want to blow the trumpet or sound the trumpet. Oh, look what I'm doing. Look how much I'm giving, or I'm about to, I'm giving my money, or whatever it is, to make a big show about their alms giving. Notice in verse number 2, that Jesus says that they may have the glory of men. So their concern is not for giving their contribution. Their concern is for having the glory of men. And also notice that Jesus says that they have their reward. So the word for reward right there, Thayer defines as of the rewards which God bestows or will bestow upon good deeds and endeavors. It's used in this context here of almsgiving. It's used in the same way for prayer, and it's used in the same way for fasting. But when Jesus says they have their reward, the glory of men that they're seeking is their reward. That's a scary thought when you think about it. You're doing these actions, partaking in these religious works, but the reward that you're getting is not the reward from your Father in heaven. Jesus tells them in verse number 1, you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. So their reward is the glory that they're getting of men, for doing these doing this selfishly, seeking after the praise of men. Verse number 5 through 8, Jesus talks about praying. He says, starting in verse number 5, when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. But when you pray, use not vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things you have need of before you ask Him. So notice here when he's talking about praying, verse number 5, he says they do it that they may be seen of men. The same thing he says in Matthew 23 and verse 5. Motivation here is to be seen of men. So when he's rebuking the practice of standing in the street corner or the corner of the synagogue and praying. Maybe these people are praying these very wordy prayers, so that they can be seen, receive praise for maybe praying such a long and beautiful prayer. But the purpose not being for them to issue the prayer. Their motivation is to receive the praise for their prayer. If you look at the definition there for vain repetitions, this is interesting to me. So for the definition of vain repetitions means to stammer or to repeat the same things over and over, to use many idle words, to babble, or to prate. Some suppose the word derived from Battus, a king of Cyrene, who is said to have stuttered. Others from Battus, an author of tedious and wordy poems. So Jesus is rebuking the practice of idle words, I guess you could say, or vain repetitions, or just saying these babblings over and over again. If you want to know what that means or how we should be praying, he gives the model prayer here starting in verse number 9. We notice that the way that Jesus prays, things are simple. He prays for simple things, for specific things. He prays humbly. He gives glory to God, know that God is in control and submits to God's will. But Jesus doesn't make a long wordy prayer here. You only got a few verses there. He tells them to pray this way. Also, verse number 7, when it says they think they shall be heard for their much speaking, Strong's gives two definitions or two words as a definition here for much speaking, and I had never heard either one of these words before I looked at it. But one of them is loquacity, which means tending to talk a great deal, talkative. A loquacious speech would imply the speech is unnecessarily verbose. The next word is prolixity, which is the state or quality of being unnecessarily or tediously wordy. So I think we get the idea here that Jesus is saying that, praying wordy prayers and babbling on and making these vain repetitions where you're saying things just, that are just to be said is not pleasing to God. You're not impressing God with your idle words and your wordy prayers. And you might impress men, but you're not impressing God. I think that's interesting. You can see there, again, in the model prayer, the type of prayer Jesus tells us to pray is simple, it's concise, sort of to the point, I guess you could say. You've got Jesus here, the Son of God. I mean, I'm sure he could have prayed the most beautiful prayer that anybody had ever prayed if he wanted to. But the model prayer we have recorded for us is the type of prayer that pleases God, not necessarily the type of prayer that pleases man. So the last one we'll look at is in fasting, verse number 16 through 18 in Matthew chapter 6. Moreover, when you fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou fastest, anoint thine head and wash thy face, that thou appear not unto men to fast, but unto thy Father which is in secret. And thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. So again, we see the motivation here, verse number 16, that they may appear unto men to fast. They have this, what Jesus calls as a sad countenance or a disfigured face, where they try to show the pain and agony that they're going through because they're fasting, and look at me, look what I'm doing, look what I'm putting myself through for God and all this. But they're not doing it sincerely. The whole purpose is so that they can get the praise and honor of men, for their fasting. So I think that all, these three works we see in Matthew chapter 6 fit perfectly with what we're looking at in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 5, when the Pharisees seek after the glory of men. This is what they're doing. They make their phylacteries broad, they make the fringes on their garments large, they do all these things only to be seen of men and not necessarily to be seen of God or to be in accordance with God's will. So that's really all I've got this morning. So we got through verse number 7, so we'll pick up next time in verse number 8. So we'll be going again next week. Brother Ed will be filling in again next week, so I appreciate that. And should be after the week after that, we'll be back and we'll pick up in verse number 8. Anybody got any questions or comments over anything else we talked about this morning? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think so.